When did the status of Arab Jews begin to change? Was it with the emergence of Zionism in Europe? Was it the Arab Revolt? Or was it the 1948 establishment of the State of Israel?
It's a gradual process, and it's difficult to put your finger on one particular date. But in the aftermath of the First World War, Britain sponsored the Zionist movement. And so one key date is the Balfour Declaration of 1917, in which Britain pledged support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. This was a classic colonial document which completely disregarded the rights and aspirations of the local people. In 1917, the Arabs were 90% of the population, the Jews were 10%, and the Jews owned 2% of the land. And yet Britain, the colonial power, chose to privilege the Jews over the Arabs. And I've written a lot about the history of the British mandate in Palestine from 1920 to 1948. But I can summarize it for your listeners in one sentence, which is that Britain stole Palestine from the Palestinians and gave it to the Zionists. That's why resentment of the Zionist movement started to build up, not just in Palestine, where the Arabs were being displaced by the Zionist project, but throughout the Arab world. There was real sympathy for the Palestinians, and there is still strong sympathy for the Palestinians throughout the Arab world today. And I'm not talking about governments, I'm talking about people. So that was one factor that changed. And the Jews in Iraq were associated with Britain, the colonial power. And because Britain was responsible for the displacement of the Palestinians from Palestine by the Zionists, that fed into hostility towards the local Jews. Then the other turning point is 1948, the establishment of the State of Israel and the First Arab-Israeli War. This is when ethnic cleansing happened. This is when Israel expelled 750,000 Arabs. They became refugees. More than half the Palestinian population became refugees, and the name Palestine was wiped off the map. This is the Nakba. It had repercussions throughout the region. The Iraqi army fought in the war for Palestine. At the end of the war, Israel signed armistice agreements with all its neighbors. These are the only internationally recognized borders that Israel has ever had, and they are the only borders that I recognize as legitimate. This is a pre-1967 borders. Iraq did not sign an armistice agreement with Israel. The Iraqi army withdrew from Palestine, and Iraq is still officially at war with Israel. It's in the aftermath of this war that there was an upsurge of hostility towards the local Jews in Iraq and elsewhere throughout the Arab world. And there was popular hostility towards the Zionists, but also there was hostility at the official level. The Iraqi government began persecuting the Jews in Iraq. The whole climate change, Jews were fired from government service. Restrictions were placed on the activities of Jewish merchants and Jewish financiers. Quotas were imposed on the number of Jews who could go to universities and medical schools. So this was a real turning point in Muslim-Jewish relations in Iraq.
In a way, you stop being Iraqi and you start becoming Israelis who are living in Iraq in the eyes of the government.
This is absolutely right in a nutshell. And I have a remote relative. He was a writer, Yitzhak Bar Moshe. He moved to Israel. In Israel, he wrote 10 books, all in Arabic. And one of them is called Al-Khuruj min al-Iraq, the exodus or the departure from Iraq. And he says, we left Iraq as Jews, and we arrived in Israel as Iraqis. But it's Israel that made all the difference, because Zionism gave the Jews a territorial dimension for the first time in 2 millennia. Now, Zionism created a Jewish state in Palestine. Anyone in the Arab world who didn't like Jews, anyone like the Istiqlal Party, the right-wing party in Iraq, which was very anti-Jewish, and any anti-Semite could say to the Jews, you don't belong here. You're not from here. You are alien. And why don't you go and join your brothers in Palestine? So the whole attitude towards the local Jews changed. And the Jewish community in Iraq, which had contributed to nation building at every level, changed, or the perception of this community changed, and from being a constructive pillar of Iraqi society, it was viewed increasingly as a fifth column.
How was the Nakba understood by Jews living in the diaspora, particularly in the Arab world? How did they think about it?
1948 was a very, very anxious time for the Jews in the diaspora and in the Arab world, because whatever they felt about Zionism, they were now seen as implicated in what was going on in Palestine. And Zionism was a movement by European Jews for European Jews, which had very little appeal to Arab Jews. And the Zionist movement the Zionist leaders had no interest in the Jews of the Arab countries. They tended to look down on them as no better than Arabs, as primitive, as backward. What changed that was the Holocaust. The Holocaust removed the main reservoir for Jews, for the Jewish state to be. And it's only then that Zionist leaders began to look for Jews from all 4 corners of the earth, including the Arab world. So the attitude of the Zionist movement towards Arab Jews changed, and now Arab Jews who had no interest in Israel were felt unwelcome, unsafe, and many of them ended up in Israel. My mother used to wax lyrical about the wonderful Muslim friends that we had in Baghdad. And one day I said to her, did we have any Zionist friends? And she looked at me as if this was a very peculiar question. And she said to me, no, Zionism is an Ashkenazi thing. It's nothing to do with us.